The dust was a constant companion. It settled in a fine red powder on the cracked leather of the stagecoach seats, coated Clara Holt's tongue, and worked its way into the very weave of her dark traveling dress. For 3 days, it had been her penance, a gritty reminder of how far she was from the green, orderly world of her father's parish in Ohio. Out here, the world was vast and empty, a canvas of sun-bleached rock and pale, unforgiving sky. The relentless rhythm of the wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the driver's occasional curse were the only sounds that broke the immense silence. Clara clutched the reticule in her lap. Inside, nestled beside a small, worn Bible, was the letter. It was sealed with a wax stamp bearing her father's initial, a severe, unadorned H. She did not need to read it to know its contents. She had heard the sermon of its words 100 times over. It was a missive not for her, but for Mr. Silas Miller, the widower rancher in a place called Dead Man's Gulch, who had agreed to take her as his wife. He would be a good man, her father had assured her, a man of property and standing, who needed a respectable woman to manage his home and mother his 2 young children. The letter would warn him. It would speak of her purity, her innocence, a fragile vessel molded by God in her father's hand, now entrusted to his care. It would instruct him to guard her from the coarseness of the frontier, to protect the untainted spirit she brought with her. Clara felt a familiar flush of shame and duty rise in her cheeks. She was 20 years old, yet the letter made her feel like a child, a piece of porcelain being shipped west with a list of careful instructions. In her heart, a secret. Shameful thoughts sometimes flickered. What if she wanted to be more than just protected? The thought was a sin. She knew, and she would quickly push it down with a silent prayer for forgiveness. She was alone. The other passengers, a whiskey salesman and a loud woman with a painted face, had disembarked at the last way station, leaving Clara to the rattling emptiness of the coach. The driver and the shotgun guard were her only companions now, 2 weathered men who rarely spoke to her. She was a parcel to be delivered, and they were the freight men. The attack came without warning. One moment, the coach was lumbering through a narrow canyon, its high rock walls painted with afternoon shadows. The next, a rifle shot cracked the air, sharp and final. The lead horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound that tore through the quiet. The coach lurched violently, throwing Clara from her seat. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The world became a storm of noise and chaos. Through the broken window, she saw the shotgun guard fall backward from his perch, a dark blossom of red spreading across his chest. The driver was wrestling with the reins, his face a mask of terror, shouting curses that were swallowed by more gunfire. Men on horseback descended upon them, their faces hidden by dirty bandanas. They were not soldiers or Indians. They were something else, something lawless and predatory. The coach slammed to a halt against a rock outcropping, the impact rattling Clara's teeth. The door was wrenched open, and a man with cruel, piggy eyes and a foul stench of sweat and cheap liquor loomed in the opening. He grinned, showing a row of broken, yellowed teeth. "Well now, what have we got here?" he rasped. He reached for her. Clara scrambled backward, her hands finding nothing to hold on to. She screamed, a thin, useless sound. Another outlaw dragged the driver from his seat and shot him in the head without a word. The sound was flat and ugly. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her mind refusing to process the horror. This was not real. This was a nightmare conjured by the devil to test her faith. The first man grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He yanked her from the coach, and she stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully as she fell to the dusty ground. Her bonnet was gone, her carefully pinned hair tumbling around her shoulders. She saw 4 of them in total, circling like vultures. "This one's a pretty little bird," one of them sneered, dismounting. "Too fine for the likes of this road." "Leave her be. Jed," another man commanded. his voice carrying an edge of authority. "We take the strong box and the horses. We ain't here for sport." The one called Jed ignored him. He knelt beside Clara, his foul breath washing over her face. "The boss man pays good for fresh ones. Untouched." He reached for the collar of her dress, and with a single, brutal rip, tore the fabric down to her corset. Clara gasped, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. She felt the hot desert air on her skin, a violation more profound than the man's touch. Her world, the carefully constructed world of modesty and piety, was being shredded along with her dress. She fought, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. He backhanded her across the face, and the world exploded in a flash of white pain. Her head hit the ground hard, dazed. She could only lie there, tasting blood and dust, listening to their rough laughter. Then, another sound cut through the canyon. It was not the crack of the outlaws' rifles. It was a deeper, heavier report, a gunshot that spoke with authority. One of the outlaws, standing over the driver's body, grunted and pitched forward, a hole appearing in his back. The others spun around, confusion turning to alarm. "Who in the hell was that?" Jed shouted, scrambling to his feet and drawing his pistol. From the rocks above, a figure emerged. He was a lone rider, sitting tall in the saddle, a rifle held steady in his hands. He was a silhouette against the setting sun, a specter of vengeance conjured from the heat and the dust. He fired again, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Another outlaw fell, clutching his throat. Clara, lying on the ground, could only watch, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a strange, burgeoning hope. The man on the horse was death come to the canyon, but this time, death was on her side. Wes Calder had been tracking a mountain lion for 2 days, but the scent of blood and gunpowder that drifted down the canyon was unmistakably human. He had learned long ago that the two-legged predators were the most dangerous. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who lived his life on the edge of violence. He saw the stopped coach, the bodies, the woman on the ground. He saw the torn dress, and something cold and hard settled in his gut. It was a feeling he knew well, a ghost of a memory that tasted like ash, a promise he had made to himself years ago, whispered over a shallow grave, rose in his mind. Never again. Not while he drew breath. He did not shout a warning. He did not offer a chance for surrender. He had seen what these men were. He simply raised his Winchester and went to work. The third outlaw, the one who had seemed to be the leader, managed to get off a wild shot that whistled past Wes's head. Wes's reply was deliberate. The man spun and dropped his gun, staring down at the dark stain spreading across his stomach with a look of stunned disbelief before collapsing. Only Jed was left. He stared at Wes, his piggish eyes wide with fear. He grabbed Clara, hauling her to her feet and pressing the barrel of his pistol to her temple. Her body was a shield. "You stay back!" Jed screamed, his voice cracking. "You hear me? I'll kill her! I swear to God, I will!" Wes stopped his horse. He sat perfectly still, the rifle resting easy in his arms. His face was unreadable, a mask of sun-browned leather and dust. His eyes, a pale, cold blue, were fixed on Jed. He did not speak. He just watched. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clara could feel the cold metal of the gun against her skin, the tremor in the hand that held it. She could smell the man's fear, a sour, animal scent. She looked at the stranger on the horse. He was not looking at her. His gaze was locked on her captor, and in those eyes, she saw a chilling lack of doubt, a complete absence of fear. "I'm warning you," Jed shrieked, his composure crumbling under that silent, relentless stare. For a fraction of a second, Jed's grip loosened. His eyes darted to the side, looking for an escape. It was the only opening Wes needed. The rifle came up. The shot was so fast, so precise, that the sound of the blast seemed to arrive after the bullet had already found its mark. The gun at Clara's temple flew from Jed's hand. He staggered back, his other hand going to his shoulder, a cry of pain escaping his lips. He was not dead, but he was disarmed and wounded. He scrambled for his fallen pistol, but Wes was already off his horse, moving with a fluid grace that was terrifying. He kicked the gun away. Jed stared up at him, whimpering. "Please, don't." Wes looked down at him, his face devoid of emotion. Then he looked at Clara, at her torn dress and the dark bruise forming on her cheek. His jaw tightened. He drew the Colt Peacemaker from the holster on his hip, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. He did not look at Clara again. He simply fired. The last outlaw crumpled to the ground. The canyon fell silent, the only sound the ragged gasps of Clara's own breathing and the soft nicker of the stranger's horse. He stood over the bodies for a moment, a tall, grim figure surrounded by the carnage he had wrought. He reloaded his pistol, the methodical clicks of the cylinder turning echoing in the twilight. Then he turned to her. He walked over, his steps slow and measured. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He simply shrugged off the dusty duster he wore and held it out to her. Clara stared at it, then at him. His face was hard, etched with lines that spoke of a difficult life. His eyes held a deep, weary sadness she could not comprehend. He was not her savior. He was something far more dangerous. He was real. She took the coat, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She pulled it around her shoulders, hiding her torn dress, hiding her shame. The coat smelled of leather, sweat, and gunpowder. It smelled of him. "We need to go," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. "The fourth one got away when the shooting started. He'll be back, and he won't be alone." Clara looked around and realized he was right. There had been 4 horses. Now there were only 3, besides the strangers. One had bolted during the firefight. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting precariously. The adrenaline that had kept her standing was draining away, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. The driver," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger. "He's dead. They're all dead," the man said, his tone leaving no room for argument or false hope. He strode over to the dead outlaws and began searching their pockets with a detached efficiency, collecting a few coins, a pocket knife, and their ammunition. He did not touch the strongbox. He was not a thief. He returned to his horse, a powerful buckskin that had stood placidly through the entire gunfight. "Can you ride?" he asked. Clara shook her head, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. I don't know." He gave a curt nod, as if expecting the answer. Without another word, he swung himself into the saddle, then reached down a powerful arm. "Up," he commanded. Hesitantly, she allowed him to pull her up, seating her in front of him. It was improper. It was scandalous. Her father's face flashed in her mind, his eyes filled with righteous fury. But her father was 1,000 miles away. In a world of church bells and Sunday socials, this was a world of blood and rock and a stranger's unsettling proximity. His arm came around her waist to hold her steady, his body a solid, warm presence at her back. She was rigid with tension, every muscle coiled tight. He spurred the horse, and they moved away from the scene of the massacre, leaving the dead to the coming night. He did not look back. They rode for what felt like hours, the horse picking its way through the darkening landscape. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. A wind began to pick up, whining through the rocks and whipping sand into the air. It was a raw, lonely sound. "Storm's coming," the man said, his voice close to her ear. "A bad one. We need shelter." He seemed to know the land, guiding the horse with an innate sense of direction. Just as the first grains of sand began to sting Clara's cheeks, he found it. A small, dilapidated hut made of stone and mud, nestled against a rock face. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years. He dismounted and helped her down. Her legs were weak and trembling, and she nearly collapsed. He caught her, his grip firm on her arm, and steered her toward the doorless opening of the hut. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust and old animal dung, but it was shelter from the rising wind. He left her for a moment and returned with their saddlebags and his rifle. He found a broken piece of a crate to block the doorway against the worst of the wind, then set about building a small fire in the crude hearth. He worked in silence, his movements economical and precise. He never wasted a motion. Clara huddled on the far side of the small space, pulling the duster tighter around herself. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a deep, shuddering cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her body ached. Her face throbbed. The memory of the outlaw's hand tearing her dress, of the gun against her head, played over and over in her mind. She felt dirty, violated. Her corset, with its torn lace and bent whalebone stays, felt like a cage of broken promises. She was supposed to arrive in Dead Man's Gulch pure and untouched, a perfect bride for a grieving man. Now, what was she? The man, Wes, though she did not yet know his name, got the fire going. The small flames pushed back the darkness and cast flickering shadows on the stone walls. He opened a saddlebag and took out a canteen and a piece of jerky. He offered them to her. She shook her head. Her throat was closed tight with grief and fear. He did not insist. He sat by the fire, chewing on the tough, dried meat, his eyes never straying far from the makeshift door. The wind howled outside, a living thing, clawing at the little hut. It was a sound that matched the tempest inside Clara. Every gust felt like a judgment. She thought of her father. He had taught her that the world was a test, that sin lurked in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. She had been weak. She had been touched by evil, stained by it. Was this God's punishment for that secret flicker of defiance she had felt on the journey? Was this her penance for wanting more than just to be protected? Wes watched her from across the fire. He saw the way she trembled, the way she stared into the flames as if seeing visions of hell. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of another woman, a woman with hair the color of corn silk named Eleanor. Raiders had come. He had fought, but he had not been fast enough. He had not been strong enough. He had failed her. The memory was a raw wound that never fully healed. He had spent the last 5 years wandering, running from the ghost of his own failure. And now, here was another woman, another victim of this brutal land. He had saved her life, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that saving a life and saving a soul were two very different things. He had kept her warm. He had kept her safe, but he did not know how to quiet the storm raging behind her wide, terrified eyes. He did not have the words. He never did. He finished his jerky and stood up. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice flat. "I'll take the first watch." He picked up his rifle and moved the crate aside. Stepping out into the maelstrom, the sand whipped around him, but he seemed not to notice. He stood with his back to her, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the churning dark, watching the landscape. Left alone in the flickering firelight, Clara sank to her knees. Her hands fumbled for the small Bible in her reticule. Her fingers traced the embossed cross on the cover, seeking a familiar comfort that felt miles away. She tried to pray. The words, once a source of solace and strength, caught in her throat. "Our Father, who art in heaven," but heaven felt impossibly distant. "Hallowed be thy name." But the only names she could think of were the ones who lay dead in the canyon. She squeezed her eyes shut, but all she could see was the flash of gunfire and the stranger's cold, blue eyes. She looked toward the doorway. Through the swirling dust, she could see a sliver of the night sky. A full moon was rising over the rocks, stained a deep, ominous red by the sand in the air. It looked like a wounded eye, weeping blood over the broken land. It was the moon of a world she had never known existed, a world of violence and survival, where prayer felt like a child's whisper against a hurricane. She was no longer just a pastor's daughter. She was no longer just a mail-order bride. She was something else now, something forged in fear and fire, and she did not know if God himself could ever make her clean again. The sandstorm blew itself out by dawn, leaving the world scoured and still. A pale, exhausted light filtered into the shepherd's hut, illuminating a scene of quiet desolation. Clara was huddled where the stranger had left her, her small Bible clutched in her lap like a shield. She had not slept. Every creak of the makeshift door, every mournful sigh of the dying wind, had sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. Her body was a map of aches and bruises, but it was the wound inside her, the tear in the fabric of her soul, that throbbed with the most persistent pain. The man re-entered as silently as he had left. He was covered in a fine layer of red dust, making him look like a figure molded from the clay of the earth itself. He carried no canteens, no supplies. He had simply stood guard through the storm, an unmovable sentinel. He glanced at her, his pale blue eyes taking in her disheveled state, then looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "The horses are gone," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Storm spooked them, took the supplies with them." Clara stared at him, the meaning of his words slowly sinking through the fog of her exhaustion. Gone? The horses? The food? The water? They were stranded. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering ember in her chest was extinguished, leaving only cold ash. "We walk," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. "There's a town, Bisbee, southeast of here. 3, maybe 4 days if we're lucky." He offered her his canteen. It was less than half full. "Drink," he ordered. She drank, the water tasting of metal and grit, but it was life. She watched as he took only a small swallow himself before capping it tightly. He broke the last piece of jerky in 2, giving her the larger portion. She ate it slowly, the tough, salty meat a chore to get down her tight throat. They did not speak again. There was nothing to say. Their world had been reduced to the most basic elements: thirst, hunger, and the vast, hostile wilderness that stretched in every direction. Their journey began under a sun that was already a white-hot hammer in the sky. The landscape was a brutal masterpiece of rock and sand, dotted with skeletal creosote bushes and the occasional thorny cactus. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravelly soil and the whisper of the hot wind. For the first 2 days, Clara walked behind him, a prisoner of his pace. Her distrust was a physical thing, a knot of fear in her stomach. He was a killer. She had seen him kill 4 men with a terrifying efficiency, his face a mask of cold fury. He was everything her father had warned her about: a godless man, a creature of the savage frontier. Yet, he had saved her. This paradox was a constant torment, a riddle her catechism could not solve. She watched him, her fear mingling with a reluctant curiosity. He moved with a purpose that was both economical and graceful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land in a language she did not understand. He never complained. He never faltered. At midday, when the heat was at its most punishing, he would find a sliver of shade beneath a rock outcropping and insist she rest while he stood watch. When they made camp at night, he would build a small fire, a tiny beacon of warmth against the immense, star-filled darkness. He would give her the spot closest to the flames and then retreat to the shadows himself, a respectable distance away, wrapping himself in his duster and becoming one with the night. He slept with his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. On the evening of the 2nd day, the water was gone. Clara's tongue was thick in her mouth, her lips cracked and bleeding. He had given her the last few drops that afternoon, waving away her protest with an impatient gesture. As twilight bled across the sky, he stopped and knelt, examining the ground. He led them into a small, rocky wash, and with his bare hands, he began to dig in the damp-looking sand at the base of a scraggly willow. A foot down, a small puddle of murky water began to seep into the hole. He let it clear, then scooped some into his hat. "Drink," he said, offering it to her. It was the kindest word he had ever spoken. She drank greedily, the gritty water the most precious thing she had ever tasted. He let her drink her fill before he drank himself. That night, as she lay wrapped in his duster, the scent of him a strange comfort against the cold, she realized that in 3 days, he had not asked her a single question. He did not ask her name, where she was from, or where she was going. He simply kept her alive. Wes Calder watched her as she slept. Her face softened in the firelight, stripped of the terror that had haunted it. She looked young, fragile, too fragile for this land. A ghost stirred within him, a memory he perpetually tried to outrun. Eleanor. Her hair was the color of summer wheat, and she laughed with her whole body. He remembered her standing in the doorway of the small cabin they were building, her hands on her hips, a smudge of flour on her nose. "Wesley Calder," she had said, her voice full of mock severity. "If you track that mud in here one more time, I will tan your hide myself." He had grabbed her then, lifting her up and spinning her around, her laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. He had promised to protect her, to build a world for them safe from the one he had left behind. It was a fool's promise. The memory shifted, darkening like a gathering storm. Smoke, the acrid smell of it burning his nostrils. Shouts, not laughter, but screams. He'd been checking a fence line a mile away when he saw the smoke. He rode his horse to lather, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. He was too late. Comancheros. They were dragging her from the burning cabin, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears and soot. He charged in, his pistol bucking in his hand. He killed 2 of them, but there were too many. One of them hit him from behind with a rifle butt. He went down, the world turning black. The last thing he saw was her face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth forming his name as they rode away with her. He had woken up hours later, his head split open, his world burned to the ground. He never saw her again. He had failed. The guilt was a cancer, eating at him from the inside out. He had sworn on her memory that he would never fail to save another. But this girl, Clara, saving her from the outlaws was one thing. Saving her from the desert, from the memories, from the man who was surely still hunting them, that was another matter entirely. The attack came on the 3rd night. They had made camp in a hollow between 3 large boulders, a defensible position. A sliver of moon offered little light. The fire was down to glowing embers. Wes was dozing. A light, alert sleep born of years of vigilance. A pebble skittered down one of the boulders. It was a small sound, one that the wind could have made, but it was enough. Wes was instantly awake, his body tense, his hand already on his Colt. He did not move. He listened, his ears straining against the silence. There, a soft scuff of a boot on sand. To his left, he silently drew his pistol, the click of the hammer a deafening sound in his own ears. A figure lunged out of the darkness, not from the left, but from the right. A feint. The man was skilled. Wes rolled, avoiding the downward thrust of a long hunting knife. He came up on one knee, bringing his pistol around, but the attacker was on him. A big, wiry man with a wild beard and the crazed eyes of a predator. It was the outlaw who had escaped, the one called Jed. He had come back for revenge. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and grunts of effort. Jed was strong, fueled by hatred. He knocked the pistol from Wes's hand, and it skittered into the darkness. They wrestled for the knife. Wes could feel the tip of the blade pressing against his ribs. Jed's foul breath hot on his face. "I'm gonna kill you slow, you bastard," Jed hissed, putting all his weight behind the blade. "Then I'm gonna take my time with the girl." Clara woke to the sound of the struggle. For a moment, she was paralyzed, the nightmare of the canyon ambush replaying in her mind. She saw the 2 figures locked in a deadly embrace by the dying firelight. She saw the glint of the knife. She saw Wes's face, strained and grim, his muscles cording in his neck as he fought to keep the blade from piercing his heart. He was losing. Something inside her snapped. The fear was still there. A cold, sickening river. But something else rose with it. A hot, fierce surge of rage. This man would not take anything else from her. He would not take the one person who had stood between her and death. Her eyes darted around the campsite. Wes's skinning knife lay on a rock near the fire, where he had been cutting leather to repair his boot. Without thinking, without allowing her father's sermons or God's commandments to enter her mind, she scrambled for it. Her hand closed around the worn wooden handle. It felt heavy, alien. She rose, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the rocks. Jed was completely focused on Wes, his back to her. She moved forward, her bare feet making no sound on the sand. She raised the knife. Her arm trembled. "Thou shalt not kill." The words were a faint whisper from another lifetime. She saw the knife in Jed's hand press deeper. She saw Wes's body arch in pain. Clara screamed, a raw, wordless cry of fury and terror, and plunged the blade into Jed's back, just below the shoulder blades. She put all of her weight, all of her fear, all of her desperation into the blow. The man's body went rigid. A terrible gurgling sound escaped his lips. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief. He turned his head, trying to see his attacker. His crazed eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not hatred, but a sudden, stark confusion. He sagged, the strength leaving his limbs. The knife fell from his hand. Wes shoved him off, scrambling for his pistol, but it was not necessary. Jed collapsed onto his side, a dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. He twitched once, then lay still. The silence that descended was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of death, a silence she had created. The knife was still in her hand, slick and warm with blood. His blood. She stared at it, at the dark, viscous liquid that coated her fingers. A violent tremor racked her body. She dropped the knife as if it were a hot coal. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. A wave of nausea rose from her gut, and she turned and retched, vomiting the water and jerky she had eaten onto the sand. The world spun, a dizzying vortex of horror. She had killed a man. She, Clara Holt, who had been taught that even a hateful thought was a sin against God, had taken a human life. She sank to her knees, and the sobs came. Not the quiet, helpless tears of before, but great, ragged, soul-shattering sobs that tore from her throat. Wes got to his feet, breathing heavily. He found his pistol and holstered it, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the dead outlaw, then at the weeping woman kneeling in the sand. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her shaking form. He did not speak. He knelt behind her and gently, almost hesitantly, put his arms around her. Clara flinched at his touch, but then, as the sobs continued to rack her, she leaned back against him. His body was solid, real, a grounding presence in her spinning world. He did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He just held her, his arms a firm, steady anchor in the storm of her grief and guilt, and let her weep until there were no tears left. When her sobs had subsided into shuddering breaths, he released her. "We have to bury him," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The animals will come." Together, in the cold light of the rising moon, they performed the grim task. He dragged the body to a shallow ravine 100 yards from their camp. Clara, moving like a sleepwalker, helped him gather stones, her hands raw and scraped by the time they were done. They built a cairn over the body, a crude monument to the violence that had brought them together. When they finished, she stood looking at the pile of rocks. A grave for a man she had killed, a headstone for the woman she used to be. Back at the camp, he rekindled the fire. He took a clean shirt from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Put this on," he said softly. Her dress was spattered with blood. She turned away, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her ruined bodice. She pulled on his shirt. It was rough against her skin and ridiculously large, but it was clean. It smelled of him, of smoke and leather, and for some reason, that was a comfort. She sat by the fire, pulling the shirt around her knees, feeling hollowed out, empty. She looked at him across the flames. He was cleaning his skinning knife, his face grim and unreadable. He had saved her life. She had just saved his. They were bound now, not by choice or desire, but by shared blood and violence. She needed to know who he was. She needed to put a name to the man who now held a piece of her shattered soul. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. He stopped his work and looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers in the firelight. He seemed to see past her fear, past her guilt, into the very core of her. "Wes," he said. Wesley called her. "Clara," she replied, the sound of her own name strange on her tongue. "Clara Holt." A new kind of silence settled between them, not of distrust, but of shared, terrible knowledge. Her view of the world, once so certain, so neatly divided into good and evil, right and wrong, was fracturing. Her father had preached of a just and merciful God, but she could find no justice or mercy in this land. There was only survival. She had committed the ultimate sin, yet she had done it to preserve life. The outlaw was evil, yet he had a mother, a name, a life that she had extinguished. The violence she had once seen as a sin was now a tool, a terrible necessity. The neat lines of her morality had blurred into a smear of desert dust and drying blood. The next morning, after a breakfast of roasted cactus pads that Wes showed her how to prepare, he brought out his spare pistol, a Colt Navy revolver. He laid it on a flat rock between them. It was smaller than the one he wore on his hip, but it looked impossibly heavy, a dense block of dark, malevolent metal. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Clara stared at it, her heart pounding. A gun, a tool for killing. I can't." "You can," he said, his gaze unflinching. "I can't be everywhere. I can't stop every bullet or every knife. Yesterday proved that. You need to be able to protect yourself. Out here, being helpless is a death sentence." He was right. She knew he was right. The memory of her own powerlessness in the canyon, of the terror of being at another's mercy, was still a fresh wound. She thought of the outlaw's dead eyes. She had been helpless then. She had not been helpless last night. Hesitantly, she reached out and picked up the pistol. It was shockingly heavy, cold and solid in her hand. Wes began his instruction, his voice patient and methodical. He showed her how to hold it, how to load it, how to aim. He set up a piece of driftwood against a rock 50 feet away. "It's going to kick," he warned, standing behind her. "Don't fight it, just be ready for it." Clara raised the gun with both hands, her arms trembling under its weight. She lined up the sights as he had shown her, her finger hovering over the trigger. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a violent roar that seemed to shake the very ground. The pistol bucked in her hands, leaping upward with a force that shocked her, stinging her palms. She cried out, stumbling back against Wes's chest. He steadied her, his hands on her shoulders. Her shot had gone wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of the target. She was clumsy. She was scared, but as the smell of gunpowder filled the air and the ringing in her ears subsided, something else sparked within her, a small, hard kernel of resolve. She had been a victim. She had been a survivor. Now, she would learn to be a fighter. "Again," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She turned and took the pistol from him, her fear now laced with a grim determination. She would not be helpless again. For 2 more days they walked, a rhythm of shared hardship settling between them. The daily shooting lessons became a ritual. Clara's initial clumsiness slowly gave way to a grudging competence. The weight of the pistol became familiar in her hand. The deafening report less of a shock. Each time she fired, she was not just aiming at a piece of driftwood. She was taking aim at the terrified, helpless girl she had been, chipping away at her with every shot. Wes watched her, a silent approval in his eyes. He saw the fear, but he also saw the iron thread of determination that ran through it. He was teaching her to kill, and in doing so, he was teaching her to live. On the 7th day since the ambush, the landscape began to change. The endless expanse of rock and sand softened, giving way to sparse grasses and the welcome green of cottonwood trees in the distance. A new sound reached them, a low, constant murmur that grew into the miraculous music of running water. They crested a low rise and saw it below. A river, a ribbon of silver life snaking through the arid land, nestled in a bend, half hidden by the trees, was a small, solid-looking cabin of adobe and wood. A thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. "We're here," Wes said, the words carrying a weight of relief that he did not allow his face to show. As they drew closer, a woman emerged from the cabin. She was not old, but her face was a beautiful, intricate map of a life lived under the sun. Her black hair, streaked with a few strands of silver, was tied back in a simple knot. She wore a plain buckskin dress and moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. Her dark, intelligent eyes took in the sight of them. Wes, haggard and trail-worn, and Clara, a scarecrow figure in his oversized shirt and her tattered dress, and her expression remained calm, betraying no surprise. "Wesley," she said, her voice low and melodic, "I see the desert tried to swallow you again." "It tried. Nyoka," Wes replied, a hint of a weary smile touching his lips. "This is Clara." Nyoka's gaze fell on Clara, and it was not a look of pity, but of profound understanding. She saw the bruises, the torn clothes, the haunted look in her eyes, and seemed to read their entire story in a single glance. "She is hurt," Nyoka stated simply. She beckoned them inside. The cabin was one small, clean room that smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something savory cooking over the fire. It was a haven, a sanctuary of peace after a week in hell. Nyoka gestured for Clara to sit on a low stool by the hearth. Without a word, she brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth and began to tend to the cuts and scrapes on Clara's arms and face. Her touch was gentle, but firm, the touch of a healer. "There is stew," Nyoka said, nodding toward the pot. "And clean water. Rest now." Clara submitted to her care, a wave of exhaustion so profound washing over her that she felt her bones might dissolve. To be touched with kindness, to be in a place of warmth and safety, was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. She ate the stew, a thick, rich concoction of rabbit and wild roots, and it tasted like a sacrament. Later, while Wes was outside tending to his gear, Nyoka sat with Clara, mending the tear in her dress with small, neat stitches. "He is a good man," Nyoka said, her eyes on her work. "He carries many ghosts." Clara nodded, her throat too full to speak. Nyoka looked up, her dark eyes seeming to pierce right through Clara's carefully constructed composure. "You were traveling to meet a man, a husband." It was not a question. "Yes," Clara whispered. "A rancher in a place called Dead Man's Gulch." Nyoka was silent for a moment, her needle pausing in midair. "The trail changes a person," she said softly. "The woman who started the journey is not the one who finishes it. Does that rancher in that dead man's town still matter, now that you are alive?" The question struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. For a week, she had been focused only on the next step, the next drink of water, the next sunrise. She had not allowed herself to think of Mr. Silas Miller, of the life she was supposed to lead. Now, Nyoka's question brought it all rushing back, but the image was faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The life of a rancher's wife, of a mother to another woman's children, of a respectable parishioner. It seemed to belong to someone else, to the girl who had died in the canyon. How could she possibly step into that life now, with blood on her hands and a killer's shirt on her back? That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. A comfortable silence settled between Wes and Nyoka, the easy quiet of old and deep friendship. Clara learned, through their sparse conversation, that Wes had known Nyoka and her husband, Taza, for years. He had ridden with Taza, had respected him. One night, a story unfolded, not told directly, but pieced together from half-finished sentences and shared, painful glances. Taza had been accused of cattle rustling by a group of white ranchers, a charge Nyoka insisted was a lie. They hadn't waited for a sheriff or a trial. They had dragged him from this very cabin. "Wes tried to stop them," Nyoka said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion as she stared into the flames. "He was 1 man against 6. They beat him near to death and left him in a ditch." She paused, the silence stretching. "They hanged my husband from a cottonwood tree downriver." Clara looked at Wes. His face was a stoic mask, but she saw the muscle twitch in his jaw, the flicker of old agony in his eyes. He had failed to save Eleanor. He had failed to save Taza. She began to understand the immense weight of the guilt he carried, the ghosts that rode with him day and night. He was not just a killer. He was a man haunted by the ones he could not protect. The next day, he laid out his plan. "Bisbee is still 2 days south," he told Clara while Nyoka was away gathering herbs. "But there's a missionary station north of here, St. Jude's. It's a week's ride, but Nyoka can lend me a horse. The women there will take care of you. Find you safe passage back east if you want it." Back east. The word sounded foreign, alien. He was trying to do the honorable thing, to deliver her to a place of safety and piety, a place that resembled the world she had come from. He was trying to put her back in the box she had occupied her entire life. A week ago, she would have wept with gratitude at such a prospect. Now, the thought of returning to that world, of facing her father's judgment and the pitying looks of the congregation, filled her with a cold, hollow dread. She would be a fallen woman, a scandal to be whispered about behind cupped hands. Wes was trying to save her, but what he was offering felt like a different kind of death. That afternoon, the turmoil inside her became unbearable. The memories of the ambush, the feel of the knife in her hand, the dead eyes of the outlaw, the thought of returning to a life that no longer fit her, it all churned within her, a toxic brew of fear and confusion. She needed to be clean. She walked down to the river, her feet moving of their own accord. The water was cool and clear, rushing over smooth stones. She waded in, the shock of the cold a welcome distraction. She was still wearing the simple shift Nyoka had given her to sleep in. The thin cotton clung to her body as she moved deeper, the water swirling around her waist. She thought of baptism, of the washing away of sins. She dunked her head under the water, the current pulling at her hair, and came up sputtering, gasping for air. But the memories were not washed away. They were still there, branded on her soul. She began to weep, the silent, hopeless tears of a lost soul. She sank to her knees in the shallows, the water rushing around her, and cried for the girl she had been and for the woman she was becoming. Wes found her there, a small, weeping figure in the vastness of the river. He had come looking for her, a knot of unease in his gut. He saw her, her shift plastered to her skin, outlining the delicate curve of her back and shoulders. He stopped at the river's edge, his first instinct to turn away, to grant her the modesty his world demanded a man give a woman. He had seen her as a charge, a responsibility, a painful reminder of his own failures. But now, seeing her so raw and vulnerable, something else stirred in him, something deeper and more dangerous than honor. He turned his back to her. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "you should come out. You'll catch a chill." He heard a splash, and then her voice, quiet but clear, came from behind him. "Don't!" He froze. "Don't what?" "Don't turn away," she said. "Please." He stood for a long moment, his back to her, the sound of the river filling the silence. Then, slowly, he turned. She was standing now, the water streaming from her hair and her shift. Her eyes, red from weeping, met his without flinching. "I don't feel shame anymore, Wes," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I think the desert burned it out of me." He walked to the edge of the water, his boots sinking into the soft mud. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a victim to be saved, but as a woman, strong and defiant in her sorrow. "They teach you that shame is a woman's burden to bear," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Shame for her body, for her desires, for the violence done to her. My father's church is built on the shame of women. All my life, I have been so afraid of sin, so afraid of being seen as impure. But when that man tore my dress, and when I killed the other one, I realized shame is a cage, and I will not live in it." He had no words. He could only listen, his own ghosts stirring in response to her confession. "Tell me about her," she said softly. Wes knew who she meant. "Her name was Eleanor," he said, the name feeling like gravel in his mouth. She was going to be my wife. We had a small place in the mountains. Comancheros came. I wasn't there." His voice was flat, a recitation of facts he had turned over in his mind 1,000 times. "I failed her." "And Taza?" she pressed gently. "I failed him, too," he admitted, the words a weight he had carried for years. "I'm good at killing, Clara. I'm not so good at saving people." "You saved me," she said simply. "I got you out of a canyon," he countered, his voice harsh with self-loathing. "Now I'm planning to leave you at a mission like a piece of lost cargo. That's not saving you. That's just passing the problem along." She waded out of the river, her wet shift clinging to her. She did not try to cover herself. She stood before him, shivering slightly, but her gaze was steady. "I am not a problem, Wes, and I am not a child to be left on a church doorstep." That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. Nyoka seemed to sense the shift between them and retreated into her own quiet world, leaving them to the space around the fire. Wes was tense, his body rigid with a conflict he could no longer suppress. His honorable plan to take her to the mission now felt like a coward's retreat. He wanted her. The realization was a painful, searing brand on his conscience. He wanted her with a desperation that scared him. It was wrong. She was vulnerable. He was a killer, a drifter with nothing to offer but more dust and more blood. To touch her would be to ruin her. But Clara had made a decision in the river. She had shed the skin of the woman she was supposed to be. She watched him, saw the war in his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He was trying so hard to be noble, to protect her from himself. But she did not want his protection. Not anymore. She moved from her stool and sat on the floor next to him, close enough that her arm brushed against his. He flinched and pulled away slightly, his whole body going rigid. "Wes," she whispered. He would not look at her. He stared into the fire, his jaw set like stone. "You should get some sleep." "Clara." She did not move. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a simple, innocent gesture, but it was charged with all the unspoken emotion that had passed between them. He remained stiff as a board, a man carved from rock, fighting a battle she could feel in the tautness of his muscles. His honor, his guilt, his ghosts. They were all there, a wall between them. She would not be deterred. In the flickering darkness of the cabin, with the scent of wood smoke filling the air, she slowly reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong. He tried to pull away, but her grip, though gentle, was insistent. She laced her fingers through his. He finally turned his head, his pale eyes searching hers in the dim light, his expression a mask of torment and longing. She leaned closer, her lips almost touching his ear, and breathed the words that would tear down the last of his defenses, the words that would change everything. "I want to know what it feels like to choose." His name was Wes. Her name was Clara. For a week, they had been two separate points of suffering, moving in parallel through a landscape of rock and heat. But in the firelit quiet of Nyoka's cabin, with her hand in his and her whispered words hanging in the air, the space between them collapsed. Her choice was a spark thrown into the dry tinder of his loneliness, and the resulting blaze was terrifying and absolute. Every instinct he had honed for years screamed at him to pull away. Honor, guilt, the ghost of Eleanor. They all demanded he stand up, walk away, and deliver this woman to the safety of the mission as planned. He was a drifter, a man whose hands were stained with blood and regret. He was no one's salvation. To touch her would be to tarnish her, to drag her down into the wreckage of his own life. But then he looked into her eyes, and he saw not a fragile victim, but a woman of terrifying strength, a woman who had walked through hell and had chosen to meet him on the other side. Her choice was not an invitation to sin. It was a declaration of life. It was a demand to be seen not as a fallen woman, but as a woman who had finally found her feet. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his calloused hand over in hers, his fingers curling around her own. The contact was electric, a current of warmth that flowed up his arm and settled in his chest, thawing a part of him he thought had frozen solid years ago. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a profound, trembling tenderness. It was clumsy and uncertain, a question asked in a language neither of them was fluent in. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He felt the tremor that ran through her body, and he answered it with one of his own. This was not the taking of a prize, but the meeting of two survivors in the dark. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "Clara," he whispered, the name an admission of defeat and a prayer of surrender. You do not have to." "I know," she breathed, her fingers tightening their grip on his. "That is the point. I want this." Her voice grew stronger, shedding the last of its doubt. She guided his hand from hers, pressing his palm flat against the warm skin of her collarbone, just above the simple neckline of her shift. The touch was a brand. "I want you." The last of his resistance crumbled. The ghosts receded, silenced by the raw, undeniable reality of the woman before him. He slid his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and kissed her again, deeply this time, a kiss of shared hunger and unspoken pain. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child and carried her to the simple pallet of furs and blankets that Nyoka had laid out for her. In the dying firelight, they came together with a hesitant grace. Every touch was a discovery. He explored the soft skin of her back, the sharp angle of her shoulder blades, the delicate curve of her neck. He was achingly gentle, terrified of hurting her, of reminding her of the brutality she had endured. But she met his gentleness with a fierce insistence. She undid the buttons on his shirt, her fingers fumbling but determined, and pressed her hands against the hard warmth of his chest. She was not a passive recipient of his affection. She was an active participant in her own awakening. Her breath was ragged against his ear, her whispers a litany of wants, of choices, of a life being reclaimed in the shadows of a quiet cabin. For Clara, this was not about pleasure, not yet. It was about power. It was the ultimate act of defiance against her father, against the outlaws, against a world that had tried to write her story for her. In the arms of this grim, silent man, she was finally picking up the pen herself. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. Wes was already awake, sitting by the hearth, staring into the flames. He had pulled on his trousers, but his shirt lay folded nearby, his back and shoulders bare. She saw a latticework of old scars there, pale lines that spoke of a life of violence she could only imagine. He had not slept. He had watched over her all night. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. A dull ache settled low in her body, a physical reminder of the night. But there was no shame with it. There was only a quiet sense of finality, of a door closed and a new one opened. He must have heard her stir, because he turned his head, his pale eyes meeting hers. There was a new gravity in his gaze, a weight of consequence. "I'm not a virgin anymore," she said softly. The words were not a confession, but a simple statement of fact, like saying the sun had risen. She was naming the change, claiming it as her own. A long moment passed. Wes looked at her, at the tangle of her hair, the sleep in her eyes, the newfound resolve in the set of her jaw. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "You were never just that," he replied, his voice a low rumble. And in those 5 words, he gave her a gift greater than any she had ever received. He saw her, not her purity, not her virtue, not the label society had placed upon her, but her Clara. Later that morning, while Wes was out checking the snares he had set, Nyoka approached Clara as she sat by the river, brushing her hair in the sun. "The air has changed between you two," the Apache widow observed, her tone gentle but direct. Clara felt a flush rise in her cheeks, but she did not look away. "Yes?" Nyoka nodded slowly. "He is a man who walks a lonely path. Wesley, he protects what he cares for with a fierceness that can break him." She paused, her dark eyes serious. "But this world is not kind to women who make their own choices. If people learn of what has passed between you, they will call you ruined. They will not see a woman who chose. They will see only a whore." The word was a slap, a cold dose of reality. Clara had been so focused on her own internal liberation that she had forgotten the world outside this peaceful bend in the river. The world of judgment, of whispers, of men like her father. When Wes returned, Nyoka spoke to him plainly, her words a stark reminder of the code he lived by. "You have taken her under your protection, Wesley. Now you have taken her honor. What will you do to restore it?" Wes's face was grim. He understood the implications. In the eyes of the world, he had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. He had compounded her tragedy. There was only one honorable solution. "I'll marry her," he said, his voice low. He did not look at Clara as he said it. The words were a pronouncement of duty, not a proposal of love. "We will find a preacher in Bisbee. It will protect her name." Clara's heart sank. A marriage of duty, a shield against shame. It felt like another cage, gilded with honor this time, but a cage nonetheless. She had chosen him in the darkness, but now the daylight world was imposing its own terms on that choice. They left Nyoka's cabin 2 days later, with a pack horse laden with supplies and a heavy silence hanging between them. Wes had a small parcel of land, he explained. A place high in the Chiricahua Mountains he had bought years ago with the intention of building a life with Eleanor. He had never been back. It was time, he said, to either claim it or let it go. It was a place to hide, a place to figure out what came next. The trail to the mountains was easier than the desert trek had been. They followed the river for a day before turning south, into the rolling foothills. As the distance from Nyoka's cabin grew, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by a tentative, fragile intimacy. They fell into a rhythm, the quiet companionship of 2 people who had come to rely on each other for everything. He taught her the names of the plants, the tracks of the animals, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. She, in turn, began to fill the silence with stories of her life back in Ohio, of the stifling piety of her father's house, of her secret love for novels with brave heroines. He was a quiet listener, but she saw the interest in his eyes, the way he would watch her as she spoke, as if she were a puzzle he was slowly piecing together. One evening, she insisted on making dinner. She had watched Nyoka and was determined to be useful. The result was a disaster. She mixed too much flour into the rabbit stew, creating a thick, pasty sludge. and she burned the bannock bread to a black crisp on the skillet. She presented the meal to him with a look of utter mortification. Wes looked at the blackened bread, then at the gooey stew. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully for a moment, and then a slow grin spread across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It transformed his harsh features, chasing the ghosts from his eyes. "Well," he said, trying to suppress a chuckle, "it's a good thing you're a better shot than you are a cook." A laugh escaped Clara, a real, unburdened laugh that felt like a release. He started to laugh too, a low, rusty sound, as if the mechanism was long out of use. In that moment, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, sharing a terrible meal, they were not a killer and his ruined charge. They were just a man and a woman, laughing in the firelight. Their fragile peace was shattered the next afternoon. They were riding through a narrow pass when a man stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in his hands. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and eyes as cold and gray as river stones. A tin star was pinned to his vest, but it was tarnished and dull. "That's far enough, Calder," the man said, his voice a dry rasp. "There's a $300 bounty on your head for robbery and murder down in Sonora. I'm here to collect." Wes reined in his horse, his body going still, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. "You have the wrong man," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My name is Wes Calder, but I have not been in Sonora for 5 years." "The poster says different," the bounty hunter replied, gesturing with the shotgun. "Tall, blue eyes, scar above the left eyebrow. It's you. All right. Now, unbuckle that gun belt, slow and easy." Wes looked at Clara, his eyes conveying a silent, urgent command for her to stay calm. He knew a bounty hunter's mind. The man had already convicted him. Arguing would only get them killed. Slowly, Wes unbuckled his belt and let it fall to the ground. The bounty hunter, whose name was Finch, ordered him to dismount and tied his hands behind his back with a practiced efficiency. He was all business, his movements sharp and economical. "What about the woman?" Finch asked, his cold eyes flicking over Clara. "She's not with me," Wes said immediately, his voice hard. "I found her on the trail. Her coach was attacked. I was taking her to Bisbee." "Is that so?" Finch said, his voice skeptical. He looked at Clara. "What's your name, girl?" Clara's mind raced. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but it was followed by that now familiar surge of hot, defiant anger. This man was not taking Wes. She would not let him. The girl who had wept by the river was gone, and in her place was a woman who had learned to fight. She remembered the wedding band in her reticule, the plain gold band meant for Silas Miller. An idea, desperate and reckless, took root. She swung herself down from her horse, her movements deliberate. She smoothed her dress, a dress Yoka had given her, and lifted her chin. She met the bounty hunter's gaze without flinching. "My name is Mrs. Calder," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror that was hammering in her chest. "And that is my husband you are tying up like a common criminal." Wes's head snapped up. He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Finch's eyes narrowed. "He said he found you on the trail," the bounty hunter countered. "He was being a gentleman," Clara said, inventing the story as she went, her mind working faster than it ever had before. "Trying to protect my name. We were married by a traveling preacher a week ago. We're on our way to his land in the mountains to start our home." She held up her left hand, displaying the gold band she had slipped on her finger. "My husband is not a robber. He is a rancher. You have made a terrible mistake." Her performance was flawless. She was the very picture of a devoted, slightly indignant newlywed wife. Her voice was firm, her posture proud. The lie was so bold, so audacious, that it had the ring of truth. Finch hesitated. A lone drifter with a bounty was one thing. A respectable married man with a wife to vouch for him was another. A mistake could bring a world of trouble down on him from a real lawman. "We can clear this all up in Bisbee," he finally grumbled, though his conviction was clearly shaken. "The marshal there can telegraph Sonora." "And what will my husband and I do in the meantime?" Clara demanded, pressing her advantage. "Sit in a jail cell while you wait? We have done nothing wrong. Look at us. We are simple people. Is this how you treat honest folks in this territory?" Wes watched her, utterly astounded. Her fire, her quick-witted defiance. It was like nothing he had ever seen. She was commanding the situation, turning the bounty hunter's certainty into doubt with nothing but her words and a will of iron. Finch chewed on his lip, his shotgun wavering slightly. He looked at Wes, then back at the fierce woman standing before him. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "All right," he said, his voice grudging. He walked over and untied Wes's hands. "But I'm riding with you to Bisbee. If you are lying, girl, it will go badly for both of you." He turned and walked back to his horse. Wes retrieved his gun belt and strapped it on, his movements slow. He walked over to Clara, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. He stood before her, his blue eyes searching her face, seeing the woman she had become in stunning, brilliant clarity. "You're not the girl I found crying in the sand," he said, his voice low and full of wonder. Clara looked up at him, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline of her gamble. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "I'm not," she answered. The journey to the Chiricahua Mountains was a quiet ascent into a different world. The oppressive heat of the lowlands gave way to the crisp, clean air of the high country, scented with pine and damp earth. They rode for 3 days, the awkward presence of the bounty hunter, Finch, a constant reminder of the world they were trying to escape. In Bisbee, the marshal, a weary but fair man named Thompson, had taken one look at Wes's steady eyes and Clara's fierce demeanor and sent a telegraph to Sonora. The reply had come back 2 hours later. The man wanted for robbery was named Wes Calder, but he was short, dark-haired, and had been captured a week prior. Finch, chagrined and grumbling, had departed without an apology. The incident, however, had solidified the lie Clara had told. To the law in Bisbee, they were Mr. and Mrs. Calder, a newlywed couple seeking a new life. They played their parts, a silent agreement passing between them, and the roles began to feel less like a performance and more like a fragile truth. Wes's land was tucked into a high meadow, a swatch of grassy earth surrounded by a silent army of ponderosa pines and jagged granite peaks. The cabin was small, sturdy, and utterly desolate. It was a single room, with a stone fireplace, a packed earth floor, and 2 shuttered windows. It was a ghost of a life that had never been lived, the air inside thick with the smell of old sawdust and faded dreams. It was clear that no one, not even Wes, had set foot in it for years. But it was safe. It was isolated. As they swept out the dust and cleared away the debris of long neglect, the place began to feel less like a tomb and more like a fortress. The world was miles away, down a winding, treacherous trail. Up here, there were no bounty hunters, no outlaws, and no judging eyes. There was only the vast, indifferent sky, the whisper of the wind in the pines, and the 2 of them, as autumn bled into the landscape, painting the aspens in brilliant strokes of gold and orange. A new kind of winter began to fall between them, the easy intimacy they had found on the trail, the shared laughter over a burnt meal, vanished in the thin mountain air. Wes became distant, retreating back into the silent, grim man he had been when she first met him. He worked from sunup to sundown, his energy relentless, felling trees for firewood, chinking the logs of the cabin with fresh mud, and hunting for game to smoke and salt for the coming snows. His kindness remained, but it was a practical, impersonal kindness. He made sure she was warm, fed, and safe, but he did not touch her. He built a second bunk for himself on the opposite side of the cabin, A hard, narrow pallet of pine boughs and a single blanket. The first night he slept there. The space between them felt like a frozen river, a chasm of unspoken words. The memory of their night in Nyoka's cabin was a living thing, a warm ember that Clara held close but that Wes seemed determined to smother with the cold ash of duty and regret. Clara understood his reasoning. She saw it in the way he would look at her when he thought she was not watching. His eyes filled with a profound, aching guilt. In his mind, he had taken advantage of her vulnerability. He had dishonored her, and his solution was a kind of penance, a self-imposed exile just feet away from her. He was trying to protect her from himself, to restore some semblance of the honor he felt he had stolen. But his honor felt like a rejection. It invalidated her choice, turning an act of reclamation into a source of shame. She fought back against the encroaching cold in her own way. She refused to be a fragile passenger in their new life. She learned to split kindling, the shock of the axe handle vibrating up her arms a satisfying sting. She hauled buckets of water from the icy stream, her muscles growing hard and lean. She learned the rhythms of the mountain, the sharp cry of the hawk, the rustle of a deer in the underbrush. She was adapting, growing stronger, while Wes seemed to be shrinking, closing in on himself. The first snows came in late October. Fine, powdery flakes that dusted the mountaintops and clung to the pine needles. The world grew quieter, softer, shrinking to the four walls of the cabin. The isolation became more profound, magnifying the tension between them until it was a tangible presence in the room. One night, a true blizzard descended, a howling vortex of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Wes had spent the day securing the lean-to where he kept the horses, and he came inside covered in ice, his face raw from the wind. He said nothing, simply shook the snow from his coat and went to his side of the room. Clara could bear the silence no longer. She watched him as he sat on the edge of his bunk, staring into the fire, a man alone in his own prison. "Are you going to spend the rest of our lives hiding on the other side of this room?" she asked, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. He did not look at her. "It is better this way." "Better for whom?" she demanded, standing up and walking to the center of the room, to the edge of the frozen river between them. "For your honor, for your guilt. What about for me? Wes, did you ever think to ask me what I want?" He finally looked up, his face a mask of torment. "I know what I did. Clara, I took advantage of you when you were at your lowest. I dishonored you." "No," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce anger. "You did not. I chose. Do you understand? For the first time in my entire life, I was not my father's daughter or some stranger's mail-order bride. I was just me. And I chose. It was the first real choice I ever made. And you are trying to cheapen it. You are trying to turn it into a mistake, a sin that you must atone for. Your guilt is an insult to me. It makes me a victim all over again." He stood up, his tall frame filling the small space. "I ruined you," he whispered, the words raw with self-loathing. "Your future, your name, it is all gone because of me." She stepped closer, until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up into his tormented eyes, and her anger softened, replaced by a desperate, aching tenderness. She saw the man who had stood guard in a sandstorm, who had given her the last of his water, who had held her while she wept over a man she had killed. "My future was a cage I did not want," she said softly. "And my name is Mrs. Calder, is it not?" She reached out and slowly, deliberately, began to unbuckle his belt. His hands came up to stop her, but she brushed them aside, her gaze never leaving his. He stood frozen, a statue of conflicted desire, as the leather slid free. "If being with you, if choosing you, is ruin," she whispered, her voice a raw, ragged thread in the roaring silence of the storm, "then ruin me again." He surrendered then, a great, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not gentle or tender, but desperate and ravenous, a release of weeks of pent-up longing and unspoken pain. He lifted her into his arms and carried her not to her bunk, but to his, and in the heart of the blizzard, they tore down the wall between them, finding a desperate, passionate salvation in each other's arms. 2 weeks later, the blizzard had passed and a fragile peace had settled over the mountain. Wes was a different man, the guilt replaced by a quiet, watchful devotion. They were a true couple now, the lie they had told the world becoming their reality in the isolation of the cabin. It was on a trip to Bisbee for supplies, salt, flour, and coffee that the outside world intruded once more. Marshal Thompson met them on the main street, his face grave. "Calder, Mrs. Calder, I'm glad I caught you. I have some news concerning your stagecoach attack." He led them to his office. A federal marshal was there, a stern man from Tucson. They had captured 2 more men from the outlaw gang, one of whom, under questioning, had revealed the full scope of their operation. "It was not just robbery," Marshal Thompson explained. "They were part of a larger ring, run by a man down in Sonora. They were targeting solitary women travelers, mail-order brides, governesses. They would kill the other passengers to make it look like a robbery. And then they would take the women across the border, to a brothel in a town called Agua Prieta." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She was not just a random victim. She had been a target, a piece of human cargo to be sold. She thought of the other women, the ones who had not been saved by a passing stranger. "The circuit judge is coming to town next month," the federal marshal said, his eyes on Clara. "Your testimony, Mrs. Calder, is the only thing that connects these men to the ambush. We need you to speak in court. We need you to tell the judge exactly what happened that day. To testify, to stand up in a room full of strangers and recount the horror of the attack, the terror, the violation of her torn dress. Her private trauma would become public spectacle, and the questions would be unavoidable. Where did she go after her rescue? How did she, a respectable mail-order bride, come to be married to her rescuer a week later, with no witnesses and no official record? Her affair with Wes, their life together, would be laid bare. Nyoka's warning echoed in her ears. "They will call you ruined. They will see only a whore." That night, back in the safety of their cabin, the dilemma hung between them. "You do not have to do it," Wes said, his voice firm. He was standing by the window, watching the snow fall. "You owe them nothing. You have been through enough. Let them find another witness." He was trying to protect her, to shield her from the shame and the judgment. Clara sat by the fire. The gold wedding band, Silas Miller's ring, a heavy weight on her finger. She thought of the women in that brothel in Mexico, women who had started a journey just like hers, full of hope or duty, only to have their lives stolen. Women who had no one to speak for them. She looked at Wes, at his strong, solid back. He had given her a gift more precious than safety. He had given her a choice. Now she had another one to make. "Those girls do not get a voice," she said, her own voice quiet but clear as a winter morning. "Maybe I can be theirs." The day of the trial. The courtroom in Bisbee was packed. It was a small, stuffy room that smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco. Clara walked to the witness stand, every eye in the room on her. She could feel their stares, the weight of their curiosity and judgment. She saw the hard-faced men and the whispering women. And, for a fleeting moment, the timid girl from Ohio wanted to run. But she looked at Wes, who was sitting in the front row, his face a stony mask, his eyes locked on hers, and she found her strength. She took the oath, her hand on the Bible, a book whose rules no longer seemed to apply to her world. She told her story. She described the stagecoach journey, the sudden, violent ambush, the death of the driver and the guard. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke of the man called Jed, of his cruel eyes and his foul breath, of the moment he had torn her dress. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. She did not weep. She simply stated the facts, her voice cold and precise. Then the prosecutor asked the question she had been dreading. And what happened after Mr. Calder intervened? This was it. The moment she could either save herself or ruin herself. She looked at the two accused outlaws, their faces sullen and hateful. She looked at the judge, at the jury of 12 grim-faced men. Then she looked at Wes again. He had given her a new life. Now, she would protect his. "Mr. Calder drove off the remaining attackers," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she did not feel. "He found me in a state of shock and terror. He took me to a safe place, a camp belonging to an Apache woman he knew. He treated me with the honor due a grieving sister. He protected me, he fed me, and when I was well enough, he escorted me to Bisbee. There was never an impropriety between us. It was a lie, a beautiful, noble lie." She could feel the shift in the room. The whispers died down. The stares of contempt softened into looks of pity and admiration. She had given them a story they could understand, a story of a damsel in distress and her chivalrous rescuer. It was a lie that upheld their world, their rules, their sense of order. The outlaws were convicted. They were sentenced to hang. Justice of a sort had been served. As they left the courthouse, the whispers followed them. But they were different now. They were the whispers of a scandal averted, of a woman whose honor had been heroically and narrowly preserved. But Clara and Wes knew the truth. In the eyes of the world, they were living a lie. They mounted their horses to ride back to the mountain, to their isolated fortress of truth. Wes was silent for a long time, the reins held loosely in his hands. "You did not have to protect me," he finally said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. Clara looked at him, the cold winter sun glinting on her hair. They had been judged and dishonored by a truth no one would ever know, and saved by a lie everyone believed. The irony was a bitter pill, but it was one she would gladly swallow. She had made her choice, and she would live with it. "They can shame me," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "They can't own me." The winter that had held the mountain in its icy grip relented slowly, grudgingly. First came the sound of running water, a faint trickle that grew into a steady murmur as the stream, freed from its prison of ice, began to sing its old song. Then came the smell of the thaw, a rich, loamy scent of damp earth and decaying pine needles, the smell of life returning. Patches of green appeared on the forest floor, and the rigid skeletal branches of the aspens softened with the promise of new buds. For Clara, the spring was not just a change of seasons, but a resurrection of the soul. The cabin, once a fortress against the howling blizzards, became a home. She found a small, sun-drenched patch of earth near the stream, and, with a spade Wes had fashioned for her, she tilled the soil. She planted the wildflower seeds she had bought in Bisbee, lupine, Indian paintbrush, and columbine, tending to them with a patient reverence. It was a simple act, but to her, it was a profound one. She was planting beauty in a place that had been born of survival. She was putting down roots. She also began to write, on the long, quiet afternoons, while Wes was out checking his trap lines or reinforcing the small corral he had built. She would sit at the rough-hewn table with paper and ink. She wrote letters not to her father. That connection felt severed, a limb lost to frostbite, but to the missionary at St. Jude's, the station Wes had once planned to leave her at. She did not write of her own ordeal in detail, but she wrote letters of encouragement, to be shared with any young woman who arrived there alone, frightened and adrift. She wrote of the strength that can be found in the harshest of landscapes. She wrote of the difference between piety and goodness, between shame and survival. She wrote of the quiet courage it takes to simply keep walking when the world has fallen away beneath your feet. She never signed her full name, only a friend. The letters were a way of reaching back into the darkness that had nearly consumed her and offering a small, steady light to someone else. They were her testimony, given not in a courtroom of judgment, but in the quiet sanctuary of shared experience. Wes watched her transformation with a quiet awe. The haunted, terrified woman he had pulled onto his horse was gone, replaced by this calm, capable person who moved with a newfound purpose. He saw the strength in the set of her shoulders as she swung the axe to split kindling, the peaceful concentration on her face as she worked in her small garden. He saw the way she would look up at the vast, open sky, not with fear, but with a sense of belonging. The love he felt for her was a constant, steady ache in his chest, a feeling so immense it often left him without words. He had claimed this land to build a life with Eleanor, but it was Clara who had brought it to life. It was her laughter that had chased the ghosts from the corners of the cabin, her presence that had turned a desolate shelter into a home. The lie they had told in Bisbee, that they were husband and wife, felt more true than any vow sworn before a preacher. But it was still a lie, and she deserved more than that. She deserved a choice, freely and truly made in the light of day. He began to work on a secret project in the evenings, using a small block of pine wood he had saved, and the sharp skinning knife that she had once used to save his life. He started to carve. His hands, though calloused and scarred, were surprisingly deft. For weeks, he worked, slowly hollowing out the wood, sanding it smooth with a piece of sandstone, rubbing it with bear grease until it shone with a soft, warm luster. He was not a man of words or grand gestures. His feelings were carved in the wood, in the careful, patient labor of his hands. One evening in late May, when the meadow was a riot of color from Clara's wildflowers and the air was sweet with the scent of pine, he came to her as she was weeding her garden. He stood before her for a long moment, turning a small, beautifully crafted wooden box over and over in his hands. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide. He knelt in the soft earth in front of her, ignoring the damp soil on his trousers. He opened the box. It was lined with a scrap of dark blue velvet, and nestled inside was not a ring, but a space waiting for one. The plain gold band she wore, Silas Miller's ring, was a symbol of a lie, of a life she had been forced to invent to survive. He wanted to give her a ring that was a symbol of their truth. "I have nothing," he said, his gaze steady and direct. "Nothing but this land, this cabin, and my name. It is not much of a name, and it has brought you its share of trouble. But I am asking you to share it with me, for real this time. I am asking you to be my wife." Clara looked from his earnest, open face to the empty box. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. This was not a proposal of duty or a shield against shame. This was a man asking to share his life with her, to build a future in the world they had made together. "Wait," she whispered, her voice thick. She stood up and went into the cabin. She returned a moment later, holding a sealed, slightly yellowed envelope in her hand. It was the letter from her father, the one she was meant to give to Mr. Silas Miller. It had lain at the bottom of her trunk for months, a final, tangible link to her old life. She had never opened it, but she knew its contents as surely as she knew her own name. Now, she needed to see the words. She needed to confront the ghost that had haunted her for so long. She broke the wax seal, her fingers trembling slightly. She unfolded the brittle paper and read the familiar, severe script. It was all there, just as she had imagined. He wrote of her piety, her obedience, her biddable nature. He instructed Mr. Miller on how to manage her, to shield her from worldly temptations. And then she came to the line that made the air catch in her throat. "I entrust her to you as a sacred vessel, her purity being her most precious dowry. It is your solemn duty as her husband to treat her as your most valued property, to guard her untainted spirit, and to ensure she remains a credit to the godly name of her family. Property, untainted, a vessel." The words were the bars of the cage she had spent her entire life in. She read them, and she felt nothing but a distant, cold pity for the man who had written them. A man who could see his own daughter as a thing to be owned and protected, not a person to be known and loved. She looked at Wes, who was still kneeling in the meadow, his face etched with concern. She walked to the small fire pit where they cooked their meals, the letter still in her hand. Without a word, she dropped the paper into the ashes. It curled, blackened, and then a small, bright flame consumed it, turning her father's words into smoke that drifted away on the gentle evening breeze. She turned back to Wes. The last ghost was gone. She was finally, truly free. She walked to him and knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands. The sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to a halo of gold. She kissed him, a long, sweet kiss filled with the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. When she pulled away, she was smiling, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was never theirs to protect," she said. That night, they lay tangled together in their shared bedroll by the warmth of the hearth. The cabin was filled with the scent of wildflowers from the bouquet she had placed on the table. The moon cast a silver light through the window, illuminating the peaceful, sleeping world outside. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, of the fire and blood and dust that had forged the woman she now was. She thought of the choice she had made in Nyoka's cabin, the choice that had led her to this moment of profound peace. She lifted her head and whispered into the quiet darkness, the words a familiar, intimate refrain. "I'm not a virgin anymore." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. A slow smile touched his lips in the dark. "You're my wife," he replied, his voice a low, contented rumble. She smiled back, a secret, happy smile that he could feel more than see. "Finally," she whispered, settling back against him, "because I chose it." The next morning, they stood together at the edge of the meadow, a tin cup of hot coffee warming Wes's hands, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. The sun was just cresting the eastern peaks, flooding the high country with a clear, golden light. And then they saw them, on the far ridge, silhouetted against the brilliant morning sky, was a herd of wild horses. They ran with a fierce, untamable grace, their manes and tails flying in the wind, their hooves striking the earth with a silent, powerful rhythm. They were magnificent, a living embodiment of the spirit of the mountain. Wes and Clara watched them, two small figures in a vast landscape, their shadows stretching long behind them. They were free, they were defiant, and they were unbroken. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments, so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.